Most outlaws kill for gold or land, but the Harpe Brothers, they killed for the sound of it. In the late 1700s, America's first serial killers turned the frontier into a slaughterhouse, leaving a trail of bodies filled with stones so they'd never be found. But their own end was even more gruesome than their crimes. Following the Revolutionary War, a massive wave of pioneers pushed west. Families loaded their entire lives onto flatboats and wagons, crossing the Appalachian Mountains to stake claims in the fertile Ohio River Valley. They were stepping into total isolation. This was a world of unpaved, deeply rutted Indian traces and silent, winding rivers. There were no constables on patrol, no telegraphs to wire for help, and no quick way to warn the next town of approaching danger. You could vanish in this vast, untamed geography without anyone noticing. For months, the dense forests and dark waterways transformed the landscape into a silent accomplice for predators who wanted their victims to disappear. Soon, travelers began vanishing along the wilderness road and the major rivers. A cold panic rippled through the isolated settlements as families waited for pioneers who never arrived. Then the bodies started to surface. Settlers walking the banks began finding horrifying remains, washed up in the shallows of local creeks and riverbeds. Every victim was treated with the same meticulous brutality. Sliced open and disemboweled, their chest cavities packed tight with heavy river stones to drag the remains to the murky bottom. This signature required time and deliberate intent. The settlers realized these deaths were no frontier accident. They were being hunted by something entirely human and entirely evil. The culprits were Micaiah and Wiley Harpe, known as Big and Little Harpe. They had spent the Revolutionary War as Tory marauders, using the conflict as cover to burn farms and brutalize colonists, wiring them for a life of extreme violence. This 1784 map shows the wilderness and sprawling rivers the brothers claimed as hunting grounds. They exploited a massive legal loophole. Since a Kentucky magistrate had no authority in neighboring territories, the brothers would commit murder, step across an invisible border, and evade lawmen. Their killings defied logic. They slaughtered a man who bought them breakfast. They butchered families who offered them a bed for the night. Big Harpe even took his own infant daughter and bashed her head against a tree simply because her crying annoyed him. Most frontier outlaws robbed stagecoaches to build wealth. The Harpes would take a victim's horse, but the theft was an afterthought. They killed for the sake of the act itself, a psychological anomaly that terrified the pioneers. With a Kentucky posse finally closing in, the Harpes fled across the Ohio River into Illinois, slipping right through that jurisdictional loophole. To avoid the news, they sought refuge here at Cave-in Rock. This massive limestone cavern, opening directly onto the river, was the headquarters of Samuel Mason, a notorious gang leader. Safe from the law, the brothers decided to entertain themselves. They began dragging captured travelers up the steep bluffs above the cave, stripping them naked and shoving them off the precipice just to watch them smash on the rocks below. Mason's men were hardened thieves and murderers, but the senseless cruelty of these pranks sickened them. The pirate gang eventually turned on the brothers and expelled them from the cave. Even in a world of cutthroats and river pirates, the Harpes were too depraved to belong. Their brand of violence existed outside the lowest standards of the criminal underworld. The brothers eventually made a fatal miscalculation. They took shelter at the home of Moses Stegall. While Stegall was away, the Harpes murdered a fellow guest, slit the throat of Stegall's 4-month-old son, and killed Stegall's wife. Stegall returned to find his family slaughtered. Enraged, he immediately formed an aggressive posse of vigilantes, tracking the brothers relentlessly through the heavy Kentucky underbrush. The posse caught up to them in the woods. A vigilante shot Big Harpe in the spine, paralyzing him as he lay bleeding in the dirt. The killer confessed to over 30 murders, showing zero remorse for anyone except his own daughter. Moses Stegall exacted a brutal retribution. While Big Harpe was still conscious, Stegall used a knife to slowly saw off his head. He took the severed skull and mounted it high on a spike at a nearby crossroads. This gruesome execution was the only language left to use to establish a semblance monuments of order in the wilderness. The settlers matched the brutality of the monsters they finally caught. Little Harpe managed to escape the shootout, fleeing hundreds of miles south to the Natchez Trace, where he reunited with his former pirate associate, Samuel Mason. Hubris finally caught up to him when a massive bounty was placed on Mason's head. Little Harpe turned on his part, decapitated him, and brought the skull to the authorities to collect the cash. But the magistrates instantly recognized Little Harpe's face. This marker on the old trace sits near the spot where Little Harpe was quickly tried and hanged. Following the execution, authorities cut off his head and spiked it on a pole along the trail. In a land without clocks or constables, those severed heads served as primitive monuments to order. They stood as rotting reminders that the most terrifying threats in the American expansion were the men who walked into the wilderness and left their humanity behind.